So we'll start with leaving Matt Hancock in post, and that ties with Durham. It ties with Barnard Castle, doesn't it? Because he can't get rid of anyone. When you are so sort of corrupted yourself as Prime Minister, you can't get rid of anyone. Because if Boris Johnson were to get rid of anyone, whether it was for lying, like Dominic Cummings, or being useless, like Matt Hancock, everyone would turn around and say, well, how come you're still in your job? You're a massive liar and you're really useless. So I think that's linked. So leaving Matt Hancock there. The let the bodies pile high in the streets rather than have a second lockdown comment. Talk about a window into the soul, or what passes for the soul of the man. The deep state comment in PMQs quite recently, which of course shows that he's willing to deploy the worst of QAnon-style conspiracy theories and deeply damaging rhetoric, the kind of rhetoric that led directly to the January the 6th attack upon the Senate building in Washington. I mean, that's a late entry from Lewis, but it's a big one, isn't it? The calibre of the cabinet that he assembled being deeply damaging to both the national interest and the body politic. The 40 new hospitals lie. The elevation of Peter Cruddas into the House of Lords, despite the House of Lords Appointment Committee advising against it. The cull of all dissenters from the House of Commons. Backbenchers who would have been prepared to speak truth to power about everything from Boris Johnson's fitness to govern right through to the realities of Brexit, all shown the door. The defence of Dominic Cummings after the blatant breach of lockdown rules that they wrote and the epic lies about eyesight and Barnard Castle. The stepping back from the legislative pledge to bring about a ban upon conversion therapy. Wallpapergate, no one's mentioned, but I've added it to the list. The begging, essentially, the desperate sort of scrounging of money to pay for ludicrous decorations at Downing Street and then claiming afterwards that he couldn't remember doing so because he'd lost all his WhatsApp messages. Again, something that Cummings describes as he claims that Johnson was contemplating even more egregious behaviours than the ones that we know about. I'd put the appointment of Dominic Cummings on the list, actually, for what it's worth, lest anyone think I set much store by what he says. But if he was lying, he'd have been sued. The £37 billion on Test and Trace and Dido Harding's tenure there. Not just Cruddas, but the calibre, the general calibre of people that he's put into the House of Lords. The Zach Goldsmiths, the Daniel Hannans, the Daniel Moylans, the Claire Foxes. Absolutely unbelievably inadequate individuals who have been rewarded not for public service or the national duty, but for blind loyalty to Boris Johnson.
This whole thing is a load of nonsense. From beginning to end.
Or providing free holiday homes. The scandal of the care homes at the beginning of coronavirus when infected people were pushed into them, were pushed into care homes. That Daily Telegraph article early on, comparing it to a medieval siege when corpses riddled with plague would be launched over the ramparts of a castle in order to kill the people inside. The skipping of 5 Cobra meetings, again at the beginning of coronavirus, when those pictures in Italy were emerging, apocalyptic, almost biblical images emerging in Italy, and Boris Johnson didn't bother going to the first 5 emergency meetings. The description of investigations into historical child sex abuse as spaffing money up the wall. I think that happened in this room. Incredible. The U-turn followed the abysmal refusal to contemplate feeding the hungriest children in the country during school holidays in lockdown. It took Marcus Rashford, a footballer, to somehow inject a little bit of decency into the heart of government. The appointment of David Frost to the House of Lords, but more pertinently to be the negotiator of the so-called oven-ready deal, which they then immediately started complaining about and threatening to break international law in order to wriggle out of the treaty commitments that they'd made, rendering us almost sort of untrustable on the world stage and ridiculous to anybody paying attention. Frost in particular seems emblematic of the Boris Johnson years, Boris Johnson's Brexit Britain, a place in which David Frost, previously known for running the Scotch Whisky Association, a role in which he was adamant leaving the European Union would be an unmitigated disaster, can end up being some sort of king across the water for the most deluded and dismal of Tory supporters. The pledge to be prepared to break international law in a very limited and specific way. allegedly instructing government departments to help evacuate animals to Afghanistan while human beings remained. The promise that there'd be no border in the Irish Sea, the misleading of the Queen, the proroguing of Parliament subsequently proven to be unlawful, the parties that were unfolding almost every night, including when Her Majesty was reduced to sitting alone in the Windsor Castle Chapel and they were having a knees up at Downing Street, never mind the ones that he actually attended himself. The attempts to save Owen Paterson after he'd been found to have breached the parliamentary standards. The attempt to rip up the rule book because one of their favourite cronies had been found to have... I nearly said something a little bit rude then. Had been found to have broken the rules. On it goes, putting the son of a KGB spy in the House of Lords. I don't think we've seen the report on that one, have we? Didn't he send it back? Have we seen what the security services had to say about that? And then, of course, revealing as Prime Minister that when he was Foreign Secretary, he'd attended a party at the Palazzo hosted by a man who's currently sanctioned in Canada for being a key member of Vladimir Putin's inner circle. Using a lie put out by far-right social media vampires about Keir Starmer and Jimmy Savile when Keir Starmer was Director of Public Prosecutions. Not just doing it, but doing it in Parliament, in the House of Commons. No depth unplumbed. Tearing up a report into whether or not the Home Secretary Priti Patel was a bully. We know that she was because A, the report said so, and B, they paid £370,000 to the man who she bullied. An act so egregious that the actual advisor on the independent advisor on ministerial standards on ethics resigned in protest. The second one resigned as well. That hasn't even made the list. Oh, boy. And then the shaking of hands with COVID patients, boasting about shaking of hands with COVID patients when his only job was to convey to the population of these islands that we had to be absolutely unprecedentedly careful about human contact in the earliest days of the coronavirus. That's your list. And then you've got the overviews, the big pictures, the step back, the breaking of trust, the corrupting of objective reality, the heartbreaking revelation that this is a country in which the worst kind of politicians can thrive. And that's not over, because I've said it before and I'll say it again, when the rest of us have been reeling with disgust and horror at what this man has done to our democracy, to our country and to our politics, Liz Truss has been taking note.
This whole thing is a load of nonsense from beginning to end.